overshadowed by its flashier cousins that got all the glory. The real workhorse of German armor was the Panzer IV. Wherever the Germans fought, the Panzer IV was there, from the beginning to the bitter end, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen wastelands of the Soviet Union, and everywhere in between. It turned young men inside into either hardened veterans or charred remains. And they weren't lacking horror stories. So, where does the story of the Panzer IV actually begin? February 1935. With the Reich still constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, German military planners discreetly issued requirements for a new medium tractor, their laughably transparent code for a medium tank. Under their revolutionary Blitzkrieg doctrine, the Wehrmacht needed a support vehicle that could accompany all their other vehicles and provide them with direct high-explosive support. The idea was that the Panzer I and II would engage infantry. The Panzer III would serve as the main anti-tank weapon with its 37mm gun, and the Panzer IV, now called accompanying vehicle, would work alongside them, filling the gap in high-explosive firepower with its short-barreled 75mm howitzer-like gun. Due to the limitations of early industry, a practical design was chosen and production began. The initial production Model A had just 18mm of frontal armor and leaf spring suspension, far less sophisticated than the torsion bar systems favored by German engineers, but significantly easier to manufacture. Only 40 of these Model A's were produced before improvements began rolling in, with additional armor plates, engine and visibility improvements, etc. Then the infamous September 1, 1939 came. Germans had just a little over 210 Panzer IVs among their 2,800 tanks. They were distributed sparingly, with 22 to 32 tanks per division, ready to shock the world. Panzer crews spearheaded the new Lightning War, pushing through Poland for 80 hours continuously. You might wonder how they managed to stay wide-eyed and combat-ready for nearly 4 days straight. The answer is Pervertin, a fancy German name slapped over what was actually methamphetamine pills, issued mostly to tank crews, especially drivers. Imagine an entire mechanized force high on government-approved methamphetamine charging straight at you. Jokes aside, drugs weren't the main reason Germans were so effective, but rather a well-coordinated operation with all army branches working closely together. The Panzer IV did its job just as intended, supporting other tanks with a howitzer that immediately proved effective. Its armor turned out to be its biggest flaw, incapable of stopping any anti-tank weapons. Later in the invasion of France, in isolated cases where panzers met French B-1 tanks, it was proved that the 75mm howitzer was useless against armor. But, as it was never intended to fight tanks, this wasn't a big deal. But we said that the Panzer IV was the main workhorse. Well, things were about to take a dramatic turn. Production began mounting up, reaching over 8,800 Panzer IVs of all models by the end of the war. The assault gun is actually the only fully tracked vehicle Germans produced more than the Panzer IV, with around 10,500 units. Panzer IV crews would find themselves facing a rude awakening on the Eastern Front in late 1941. The German High Command had expected another swift victory, and initially everything seemed like one. But soon their tank crews encountered Soviet T-34s and KV tanks, which were virtually immune to almost everything the Germans had at the time, except for 88mm flak anti-aircraft cannons. On the other hand, their panzers were being pierced by Soviet 76mm high-velocity guns. Hitler, reading these panicked reports, made one of his rare, sensible military decisions. At first, the Panzer III was upgraded from 37 to 50mm cannon, but this one also quickly became obsolete, because the tank designed to fight other tanks could no longer be up-armed due to its smaller turret ring, which couldn't accommodate anything larger than a 50mm gun. Hitler ordered the development of a high-velocity 75mm gun for the Panzer IV, which had a turret ring 14 inches larger. The result was the F2 variant, equipped with the quite formidable version of the famous 7.5cm Pak 40, now capable of penetrating 78 millimeters of armor at 1,700 meters. Thus, the Panzer IV became something entirely different than originally designed, with a weapon completely opposite to the 75 millimeter howitzer. But what about the crews? They were designed and trained as essentially artillery support on tracks, and all of a sudden they got a high-velocity gun and became a designated anti-tank weapon and a main battle tank. Although crews with these upgraded tanks had some sense of relief as they finally had fighting chance against the Soviet behemoths, they were about to be pushed into an even more dangerous position to fight other tanks. And there would be no shortage of that on all fronts. The Panther, that was from the ground up made to fight tanks with sloped armor and arguably one of the best anti-tank guns of the war, was intended to replace the Panzer IV for its medium tank role. However, as the Panther was rushed into production to be ready for battle at Kursk, many of it found out in the field. So the Panzer IV had to still pull most of the weight. Because it was a well-designed platform from the beginning, the Panzer IV had enormous room for improvements, at least when that was possible. An additional 30mm armor plate was bolted directly onto the original 50mm frontal hull armor, and the distinctive shirt and side skirts were added along the sides to protect against anti-tank rifles, and even came in handy for pre-detonating shaped charges of American bazookas away from the main armor. But crews were frustrated by how those skirts were easily torn off when driving through dense brush. The frontal armor in upgraded versions was now strong enough to deflect Sherman's 75mm medium-velocity shells. By early 1943, the Panzer IV was facing a new enemy in North Africa. The F2 and G variants became known as Panzer IV Specials among British tankers, who quickly learned to respect their firepower. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, they destroyed over 24 M3 Grants and early model Shermans while suffering minimal losses. The longer L-48 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor easily at over 1,100 meters, while the Sherman's 75 millimeters needed to close to within 450 meters to have any hope of penetrating the Panzer IV's enhanced glacis plate. North African combat proved unique for all tankers, and Panzer IV crews fared no different. Machines and people were brought to the breaking point in extreme heat during the day and cold at night, with flies and sand everywhere. Inside temperatures easily exceeded 52 degrees Celsius, 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The five-man crew fought from basically an oven, surrounded by ammunition, equipment, and each other's sweat. Metal surfaces were untouchable by bare skin, and they could and did literally bake eggs on their armor. They were fighting over fuel and water more than anything else. Sand and dust in the lubricant oil could turn grease into grinding paste, causing guns to jam, tracks to disintegrate, and engines to overheat or seize up. In the open desert, a broken-down Panzer could easily mean death or capture, so crews were highly motivated to improvise repairs. By May 1943, the Africa Corps was cornered in Tunisia, outnumbered, and cut off from supplies as the Allies pressed their final offensive, with no route of escape as defeat became inevitable. Orders were given to destroy any remaining panzers to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. One veteran recounted how his crew poured sand into the fuel tank, ran the engine until it seized, then hammered rocks into the barrel, loaded an HE shell, and fired the gun remotely with string. This left the tank completely wrecked, with dead engine and exploded gun, so it was useless to the enemy. However, if you could ask any veteran Panzer crewman about their worst posting, they'd usually point east.
Besides the fact that 78% of all Panzer IV losses occurred there, just the nature of the front and combat were outright horrifying. Mass waves of Soviet tanks charging in seemingly endless numbers and extremely close combat broke tankers' psyche. The subtle minus 38 degrees Celsius temperatures, snow and mud, wreaked havoc on machines and people, just like heat and sand in Africa. The transmission fluid became so viscous that it had to be heated with torches for up to an hour before the tank could move. The Maybach engine starter system frequently failed, forcing crews to light small fires under the engine, then use the inertia hand-cranked starter system.
Even fuel and grease could freeze, making just putting the tank in working order a nightmare. Crews improvised to somewhat heat their tank overnight and slept inside breathing gasoline fumes to not freeze to death. While frostbite was a common thing, ammunition storage was another horror for its crew. The Panzer IV carried between 82 to 89 rounds of 75mm ammunition, depending on the variant, and it was stored in bins throughout the fighting compartment, including vulnerable positions in the hull sides. Unlike late-war American tanks with wet ammo storage that cleared their lights every time reputation, a penetrating hit in Panzer IV often caused catastrophic secondary explosions. German tankers called being hit brewing up, a darkly humorous euphemism for the tank erupting into flames as ammunition cooked off, giving crews at best mere seconds to escape. You can find such photos on the internet where crews didn't manage to get out in time. Then imagine that you're looking at this site as a tanker of the same type of tank, knowing that same fate might happen to you at any moment.
By late 1943, Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks and improved T-34s with 85mm guns began emerging on the battlefield. The Model H tried to address this with additional armor, but there wasn't really much they could do, as the tank was now weighing over 26 tons despite being designed as a 16-ton vehicle. On the Western Front, after the invasion of Normandy, Panzer IVs fought heavily with Allied Shermans and Churchills, but the tanks were not such a problem as Allied superior artillery, handheld anti-tank weapons, and ground-attacking aircraft that terrorized German armor. As resources dwindled, quality suffered. The final variant, J, introduced in April 1944, was actually a step backward. The auxiliary 200L fuel tank was moved into the crew compartment to extend range, but this made it more vulnerable to fires. The power traverse system for the turret was eliminated entirely, so gunners had to manually crank the turret. Now a full 360-degree rotation took at least 65 seconds, compared to just 15 seconds with power traverse.
Because of shortages of rubber, road wheels were now made all steel, giving it a funny reputation that it could be heard miles ahead as tracks were squeaking. Manganese shortages also made all German later war tanks suffer from brittle armor, and even paint was in scarce supply. They'd paint just the upper part of the fighting compartment white for better visibility and leave the lower part with just anti-rust protection. Because of bombings taking a heavy toll on factories, spare parts became so scarce that maintenance units regularly cannibalized disabled tanks to keep others running. At least this was an advantage, as all Panzer IVs had standard and interchangeable parts, and older variants could easily be fit up with parts of newer models, and vice versa. With factories in ruins and resources dwindling, the final chapters of the Panzer IV story would reveal just how desperate the Reich had become. Panzer crew training had been shortened from the original 16-week program to barely 5 weeks. Even the intercom systems were often absent in late production tanks. The driver training before combat deployment had been reduced, resulting in frequent transmission failures as inexperienced drivers mishandled the delicate gearbox. Young crews with barely 3 weeks of instruction were being thrown into combat against battle-hardened Allied and Soviet tankers. The life expectancy of a Panzer IV crew on the Eastern Front had dropped to roughly 12 to 14 days. While the Tiger was an over-engineered prima donna that was giving Germans some desperate hope, the reality was that for every operational Tiger on the front lines, there were 18 Panzer IVs. And the average operational readiness rate for Panzer IVs stood at 64% versus just 35% for Tigers. So even when Tigers were on the battlefield, more than half of them weren't working. As Germany sought to use everything they had, available Panzer IV hulls were used for the creation of many other vehicles like the Jagd Panzer IV or Sturmgeschütz IV, and even Panzer IV with a 150mm gun. As the war situation deteriorated, fuel shortages and no spare parts meant tanks were abandoned when they stopped. The once proud spearhead of Blitzkrieg had become static pillboxes dug into defensive positions as the Reich collapsed around them. Yet somehow, the Panzer IV's story didn't end with Germany's surrender. Over 320 vehicles were supplied to Nazi allies during the war. Syria even deployed Panzer IVs against Israel in 1967 in the initial phases of the Six-Day War, ending a remarkable 30-year combat career for a tank designed as infantry support in 1935. Today, just 29 Panzer IVs survive in museums worldwide. When you stand before these battle-worn veterans, remember, they weren't just machines, but homes to 5 young men who lived, fought, and died inside these cramped steel boxes.